There are certain unusual stories that are told in my family. One goes like this. My grandfather had a best friend named Tom. They did everything together. They grew up together. They played the same sports in high school, and they went to the same college. They both became artists. My grandfather a painter, Tom a sculptor. And through some twist of fate, both Tom and my grandfather ended up teaching in the same university department in Philadelphia. Everyone knew that they were bonded in some way, close and tight, almost like brothers. One day, the story that my family tells, my grandfather was driving to work. Maybe he had a class to teach. Maybe he just wanted to paint in his studio. Maybe he was meeting students. Maybe he just wanted to see Tom and talk art. It was an ordinary morning on an ordinary day. But on that morning, on the way there, my grandfather started to cry. He didn't know why. He just felt something within him that was incredibly sad. His cries turned to sobs so intense that he had trouble driving. When he arrived at work, there was no way that he could hide that he had been crying. His eyes were blotchy and red. He was sniffling. He was barely holding it together. He walked into the department office where the desk of the office administrator sat, kind of holding court over the various faculty rooms. And as soon as he opened that door, she ran up to him. "I am so sorry," she said, and gave him the kind of hug that is reserved only for really bad news. My grandfather was stunned and stumbled over his words. "I don't understand," he said. "What is going on? I feel awful and terribly sad, and I don't know why." The administrator pulled away from the hug, confused, held him, his arms at shoulder length but firmly. Perhaps she thought he was just struggling with the news. Perhaps he was just overwhelmed. "You must know," she said, "that Tom had a stroke this morning. He's gone. We got a call from the hospital 10 minutes ago. I thought you knew. You were so upset." Now, in that moment, the story goes, my grandfather understood what had happened. The story goes that somehow he drove that morning to work. He must have known, sensed in some way what had happened, even though he had never been told. This was before cell phones. He had no way to know, not consciously, of course, but somehow through some other means, my grandfather must have sensed it. No one in my family suggests a way that he would have known, that some overwhelming sadness overcame him because of his friend's sudden death. Maybe it is suggested his friend was communicating with him in some way. Or maybe my grandfather had some sensitivity to Tom given their lifelong bond that extended into the afterlife. No one knows. No one explains it. And this is just one of the stories that my family tell that are like this. Other relatives have similar experiences. Some have felt the presence of someone in the room undeniable so much that it causes their partner in bed next to them to start when that presence appears in the room. Others have seen the face of deceased people in mirrors at their memorial receptions. Others have had the impossible synchronicity of having the exact same dream as a close friend on the exact same night. Even I have not been immune to this. Once dreaming that a family friend passed away, only to learn a week later that that very night he had passed into a coma, which he would die of a few days later. When I first started hearing these stories, which were after my childhood, I was an adult at that time, that my family had some kind of sixth sense, some kind of shining, if you've seen that movie, I did not know what to feel. In some ways, it was creepy. The whole thing sounded anxiety-producing and disturbing. I didn't want to turn around and look in a mirror and see someone else's face staring at me, or to wake up peacefully in the night to feel that something was staring at me from beside the bed. Sounds like a horror movie. On the other hand, though, it sounded kind of cool, like a superpower that's passed on in the family, something special that we have, a spidey sense. It made our family interesting and special. It helped that I had been reassured from all my family that nothing that happened was actually creepy or disturbing. Somehow the presences, the faces in the mirror, were always incredibly loving, that they were peaceful, that they were there to reassure, to say, it is okay that I am gone. No malevolence was felt. But beyond those initial reactions, the feeling of discomfort and excitement, perhaps the biggest thing that I felt when I heard these stories was skepticism. It all sounded pretty kooky, far out, delusional. The kind of thing that if anyone else told me about, I might just assume that their connection with reality was tenuous. And then I would quickly move on to other things. I've always prided myself with being rational, objective, and discerning. I believe in science. I believe in critical thinking. I am skeptical of things I can't see because there are so many people out there who claim so many ridiculous things. They can't all be right. I can't listen to them all. As a minister, I have seen also the harm that superstition can do. I have seen false prophets and snake oil salesmen who tell us to trust them because they know they have felt the Spirit, they have a special relationship with God, and we should believe in them, only to find out later that they are frauds. I have seen people live for the afterlife, believing in a world of heaven or hell and angels and demons, and through this belief lose out on the life that they have right in front of them, that we know for certain that they have. I have had people assure me with every confidence, every fiber of their being, that they believe that God performs miracles, but when their child gets sick, are left heartbroken and confused when God offers no miracles for them. As a Unitarian Universalist, I am trained to be sensitive to these things because there is abuse that is used when it comes to superstition. And we are a faith tradition that is grounded in the Enlightenment thinking, a movement back 200 years ago that prized itself in rational thought. It caused Thomas Jefferson to go through the New Testament and cross out in red letters anything that he thought never happened, miracles, superstition. And that Bible became much thinner because of it. Scientists like Isaac Newton, Lewis Latimer, Joseph Priestley, Buckminster Fuller, they were all Unitarians. It's part of our tradition to be skeptical, to acquire rational thought and proof for the things that we believe in and see. Even Darwin was raised in a Unitarian household. Many of us here are here because we left traditions that asked us to believe in things we couldn't see. Maybe that was the resurrection of Jesus, or the plagues against Egypt, or that the angel Gabriel dictated the Quran to Muhammad. And even if we do believe in something that we can't see, whether that is crystals, whether that is in God, we tend to be rationalists even in how we approach these things. And yet, because of my family's stories, I am stuck in between these two commitments. To be the rationalist person that I am, and to trust and hear and listen and respect the experiences of people who in all other areas of life are reliable storytellers, dependable, trustworthy. I was thinking a lot about these stories this past summer. My fiancé and I went to Ireland and England. It was my first trip to Europe. I'd never been there before, and it was pretty spectacular. Growing up here in the United States, you grew up hearing so much about Europe. So much of our cultural tradition is from there. So much of our stories, whether it's from the Middle Ages, the fantasy, comes out of this context. And I found Ireland especially exciting and interesting. I learned while I was there that it is distinct from a lot of European countries because it was never conquered by the Romans. And what was distinct about that and special about that is that it has retained, in a large degree, the culture and the stories and the mythologies, the Celtic culture that had been destroyed in other parts of Europe where the Romans had conquered. There remains a legacy that is older than the oldest castles, older than St. Patrick, older than the English conquests. And part of that legacy is mythology. Stories from pre-Christian times. Stories of places throughout Ireland inhabited by magical beings, sometimes called fairies, sometimes called other things. The nature of the magic depends on the stories and the myths that you read, but in all of them, it is assumed that the world in which the people of Ireland inhabit is part of a world that we cannot always see, that there is our world and another world happening just around us all the time. Knowing that these stories are told and sometimes believed, it gives you a different sense of the world and your own life. Here in America, we talk about finding places that are magical and sacred, but often that's just a sense of sentiment, right? We find some woods that feel special, and we feel it, we feel good in those places. There aren't millennia of mythology suggesting that perhaps those woods are actually full of spirits. In Ireland, you have spirits, and they have names and histories and thousands of years of legends and cultures, and people claiming that there are stories right there. On our trip, we went to one place that was supposed to be especially magical. It was outside of a tourist destination that many of you may have heard of, Blarney Castle, where you can go and kiss a famous stone that gives you the gift of gab. The lines up to that stone were way too long for us, so we went to a woods that was nearby that was supposed to be what people in Ireland call a thin place. A thin place is a place where the line between our world and the spirit world is particularly thin and narrow. In Ireland, generally they believe that this line between our world and spirit world is 3 feet. It's not that large. But in thin places, like the woods we went to, it was especially even thinner. It's where this veil can be permeated, where you can walk and be and get that sense that there is something else happening around you, some other magic, some other spirit. And what was surprising to me was that being in that thin place was a powerful experience, and one I didn't expect to impact me, because it felt like I was part of something deep and magical. I felt like those magical creatures might actually be there. They had these little plaques around that said, in this time they had this, and this supernatural thing was supposed to happen if you did this. And it was special. And I don't know if I believe them in the literal way, just like my family's stories. But it did make me wonder, is there a virtue in all of that? In suspending our skeptical minds, when we allow something unusual to take hold, when we say that we don't have to always know what's in front of us to enjoy it, that we don't always have to be our sophisticated, rational, modern people. Part of it is just fun, to be surrounded by a feeling of magic and mystery and thousands of stories that are thousands of years old. But it is deeper than that too. Being in these thin places, imagining that something else is there. It makes us feel like we are connected to something timeless and transcendent. The world around us isn't just banal, but multi-layered, full of surprises and worth paying attention to. In a world without superstition, without a feeling that magic might actually be real, without thin places and sixth senses, we risk believing in materialism, where nothing is special, mysterious, or astonishing. We risk numbing our imagination, that part of us that believes in the joy of not knowing. We risk losing that special kind of exhilaration that emerges when we let our mind play with possibility without knowing where the destination or where that play will end up. But I think mystery is good for the soul. Magic and fantasy and ghost stories too. I think that being surrounded by things we don't understand takes us to a different spiritual and emotional and mental place. It lets us transcend ourselves, get out of our heads, reminds us that we don't and can't know everything. I think it gives us the freedom to not despair when the world is falling apart, when the bad news just keeps coming, because we are reminded that the world is complex and vast and unknown. And it lets us feel joy at inhabiting a world that is full of surprise and wonder. We don't even have to believe in any of it to feel those things. Now, there are dangers, I think, in letting our imaginations run too wild, in believing in things too deeply that we can't see and understand. There's a danger of having it be a slippery slope, of becoming unmoored in the world that we do know is real, privileging fantasy over real things and real people. That is that slippery slope into delusion. That leads us to dark places where more than often people are hurt, real people, at the expense of some idea that we can't prove. It's like when religions teach that there's no reason to help the poor because they will be rewarded in the afterlife anyway, that this is just the preamble to the real thing, and so their suffering is okay. Or the belief that children do not need medical care because faith will save them. That is the wrong kind of fantasy because it privileges what we do know to be real and true and important, the life of a person. Instead, it privileges fantasy, imagination, and magic. But we, I think, are smart people. We can hold two ideas in our hearts and our heads at once. We can let ourselves enjoy and find meaning in the stories, the myths, maybe in our experiences of the supernatural that we can't understand, but still feel right in some way, in the thin places, without losing the integrity of our rational mind or giving in to harmful fallacies. And this is how and why we celebrate Halloween. We have thin places in this world, and we have thin times. Halloween is one of those thin times. In ancient cultures, across cultures, this period, the night of Halloween, is a time when the veil between worlds is less. That is a scary thing and is an exciting, exhilarating thing. So at this time, when you celebrate Halloween, when you think about trick-or-treating, and when you think about dressing up in your Halloween costume, and coming next Sunday and carving pumpkins here at 4th U, think about how you can let your imagination run wild. How you can give yourself permission to open up a sensitivity to that magic that you may feel, those little synchronicities in life, and be assured that you are not disappointing your rational self. It is not an either-or. You can give yourself permission to embrace the impossible, the absurd, to feel the pleasure of imagining a world that we just can't see, but still sparks something deep inside. We can do that as rational Unitarian Universalists, as folks who believe in science, who love truth. We can be all of those things, but also embrace the spirit of this season and the joy that comes with mystery, all around us, all the time, thin place, thin time. May it be so, and amen.